Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News America. Today is Saturday, September 13th, 2025. We're going to be delving into the 2026 Senate election in Texas specifically. Usually I don't do these necessarily in-depth videos as often, but now we have a very interesting field on both sides, so I thought I would give it a go this time around. Ladies and news, your one, so for all things elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news, subscribe below for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian elections. Also, sure follow us on all our platforms on Substack. We make posts for all that and also have updates as well. We also make long form articles for more in depth information on all of these recent elections and such. So, that is definitely something interesting to check out. And then we also do end up having our threads where we also put out news as well as on X as well. Those we will always be able to get the news fastest, and so that'll keep you up to date on everything as it all comes out. So then mind make sure to follow us on all our platforms. That also includes Instagram as well. Remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. So, moving on now to the video here, we have the 2026 Senate election in Texas. And so, what we're looking at here is a potential, very interesting primaries, both in the Republican and Democratic sides. So, generally, there's a very strong bias towards an incumbent or not. Like in Maine, Susan Collins is probably going to run unopposed in that primary. You have Markey in Massachusetts. You have Cory Booker, Warner, Capito, Haggerty, Graham. Tuberville is actually running for governor. But other than the people who are retiring, for the most part, which you can see all right here, running for governor, just retiring, just retiring, just retiring, 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 retiring. But other than all these incumbents don't generally ever get challenged because it's generally as long as they're holding a seat, they're doing something good for the party, unless it's seen that it could be beneficial to challenge them. And it's also less common to challenge an incumbent in a competitive state because it can actually end up harming their chances in the general election, which is what we're seeing in some states like the Republicans in Georgia harming their chances there. You have such a case, I believe, in Maine. If Janet Mills jumps into the race, then that could make things even worse. And you also could potentially have that in Ohio, and now we also have that in Texas. So that's going to be the problem here is now that there's going to be competitive primary. That's because, generally speaking, like in Georgia, for example, John Ossoff has already been campaigning. But if there's a primary election, like we have in Georgia, obviously, you can see there's quite a field here, mostly between Buddy Carter and Mike Collins. Those two are going to be campaigning against each other, while John Ossoff is easily just going to be able to do be the fundraising giant that he is and continue to just basically flood the market with ads and get his campaign together instead of having to compete with anybody, which they will have difficulty doing. So he will have a head start. So that's why it does end up typically hurting in quite a few states. And so that, but it's not necessarily true for Texas because this time around there is a Republican challenger to the incumbent John Cornyn. He won by 9.6% in 2020. As we can look here in the table, that was quite a good bit of an overperformance, 7.38 to the right of the nation. That actually is an underperformance by 4.42%. So based on that, based on the current predicted partisan lean of the nation as a whole, that would be a 7-point win for Cornyn, which isn't close by any means, but is a bit closer than they might like in Texas, but that wouldn't be out of line for Texas in general, as everything since 2018, all those Senate elections since 2018, when Beto O'Rourke came within 2.75 points of de-seating incumbent Ted Cruz, every single race since then has been under 10 points, all three cycles since and including then, and that includes 2020, John Cornyn winning by John Cornyn winning by 9.5 points in 2020. And so that margin is not necessarily close again, but we're going to be looking at the actual competitiveness of both primaries, as we're going to be seeing there's actually a lot more going on there. So in Texas itself, looking at the state as a whole, as nationally, Donald Trump is at a minus 13 approval rating, according to The Economist. But if we scroll down to the state by state, Texas actually has the second worst approval rating for Donald Trump of any state that he won, except for Michigan and Wisconsin. It's actually tied with Wisconsin at minus 12.6 for all adults. Michigan's worse at 13.3, but even the Biden Trump states, other than Michigan, are all higher, and Wisconsin is the same, are all higher than Texas. However, for the 2024 voters, then all of a sudden every single Trump, Biden Trump state is in fact in red still, not by as much, but they are all still in red. But Texas is the closest of all of the states at just 1.3% positive, which should be concerning for the Republicans, considering that he did just win that state by an impressive 13.7%, the highest margin in the state going back to 2012, and is actually higher than it was in 2008 as well. So that is pretty concerning, and historically, it's not ridiculously high. I mean, it was low during the Clinton years, obviously, but then Bush actually in 1988 won it by less, which is pretty insane, honestly. Reagan won it by a bit more, in just 0.2% more against Carter in 1980, and 1976 was the last time that it went for a Democrat. The closest that it got was against Biden, 5.5 points for Trump in 2020, when there was some speculation that it might flip, and then it ended up definitely not, along with Florida, Ohio, and Iowa, as well as North Carolina. So all of that together, this was a huge surge. It was one of the largest surges in the entire country. Only a few went further, and that was just New Jersey and New York. And then if you look down at the bottom, the ones that went more were Florida, California, and Massachusetts. And then right there is Texas by 8.1%. So that is right there the seventh highest shift to the right in the entire country. If we look at the actual number that it went by itself, that is already going to be from 10 points to the right of the nation to 12.2. So it did actually shift to the right in respect to the nation, which is a large reversal of what had been happening, 19 to 19 and a half, a little bit of a right trend, but then it dropped all the way down to 11 and then down to 10. So this was headed in the right direction for Democrats for the most part, but then it went back up to 12, which is actually worse than it was in 2016. So in respect to the nation, 2024 was the best that Texas has had. And so, interestingly enough, the weighted national result ended up actually being the exact same as the number in 2024. But the end weighted result is actually 11.06. So, what we end up with is that generally the trend is still a bit towards the Democrats. So as you can see, recent trends have been a bit more towards Republicans because unweighted is bluer. So that means that most of the bluer stuff is actually behind, since it's weighted to have the more recent trends a bit more. So it has been trending a bit more towards a bit less towards Democrats, and actually trended towards Republicans the last time around. I'm not sure that's going to exactly continue, but still is something absolutely of note here and is worth mentioning. So that right there, again, showing that approval rating in a state that Trump did so well in should be relatively concerning for the Republican Party. And that's more of a general state outlook. What we're going to be doing is then first off going over the Democratic primary, and then we're going to be taking a look at the Republican primary in not too long from now. This shouldn't be a ridiculously long video. So again, one last thing for the general, it's about a 3-to-1 chance right now for Republicans. It's been roughly the same the entire time. The highest it was right around 80 and a half I don't think it's gotten any higher than 81%, 82%. So right about here is highest in the beginning of August for some reason, but it's more or less just variation. It's been very consistent for the most part, around 75%. So we're looking at for the Democrats is generally not quite a while ago, actually. We can look back on the news going back quite a bit. We can see that we do have a the announcement itself was quite a while ago, and so it was a relatively old piece of news, potentially not even on here, but he did announce his election bid quite a few months ago, and so that's probably actually going to be in the YouTube feed there for news. He announced quite a while ago. It was probably one of the earlier decisions. So he stepped into the race a while ago. He was the U.S. nominee for the Senate in 2024. He's the one that lost to Ted Cruz by 8.5 points, which, with the slight blue shift, actually does mean that he did um, perform 9.8 points to the right of the nation. However, while that sounds very poor, if we look at the WAR rating, which is the wins above replacement, which essentially is just a very it's just a general way of saying how a how much better or worse a a candidate does better or worse than a generic Democrat versus a generic Republican. And so we're going to look at the split ticket wins above replacement. And so based on that, let me get that up. There we go. And so based on that, we have is the Senate wins above replacement. And in Texas, it is D plus 6.6. So as you can see here for president, it was basically 20. It was basically 14%. But for the Senate, it was 8.7, which means it was quite a bit closer than it was for the presidency. He did do much better, and not only just by strict uh, by any straight up just doing just having less turnout. If we look 5 million votes for him there, 5 million. Kamala Harris only got 4.8 million, which means that 200,000 people that didn't vote for Kamala Harris voted for Colin Allred, which means that there were some people that went to the polls in Texas that voted for Donald Trump and then voted for Colin Allred, which means that he was definitely able to overperform in ways that Kamala Harris wasn't. And as you can see, he also did win. I believe that's Denton's up there. That's Colin. That's Dallas. I don't remember what county that is, but he was able to win that one. He was able to win Williamson as well. He won Bexar by quite a bit. Some of these large cities, he won Harris County down here by more than Kamala Harris did. But all of that together, he did relatively well. He did better in El Paso. He didn't completely lose the Rio Grande Valley region, which Kamala Harris completely collapsed in. So all of that together was a general trend that shows strength for him in general. And as a candidate, as well as obviously the split ticket WAR rating being 6.6. Now, that is a bit for being Ted Cruz in general. If we look at 2018 in the Senate, you can see that it was 5.8, which actually means that he, in theory, did better. The question is, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that Ted Cruz did worse in 2024? Does it mean that Colin Allred is a better candidate than Beto O'Rourke? There's a lot of things going on since there's three different candidates there and multiple different. And there's John James. That's why he's a formidable candidate. Um, that's why it's also a slight concern there. So that's why it's really a hmm. Roy Moore was an abominable candidate. That actually was a special election that happened later in the year. So the main thing going on here is that really actually ended up being redder. So I actually haven't really looked this over much. That's why I'm a little bit like stuck here right now. So the obviously the incumbencies generally were blue, except apparently Eric Hovde is a very strong candidate, and so is Dave McCormick, who is generally I think able to work on that populist message that Donald Trump was doing at the same time. So what we have there, and that's actually very interesting considering that Nella Dominici was actually the daughter of the last Republican senator in the state of New Mexico, and that's because Kerry Lake is a weak candidate. But generally, that D plus 6.6 generally does show that he's a relatively strong candidate. So that's the point there. And so that could potentially end up aiding him. But now we have James Tallarico, who joined in the race just a few days ago, 11 hours ago, 2 days ago. So that is essentially about 3 days ago or so. And he's a relatively strong candidate by his own right in basically every single way. He's relatively hyped up by the Democratic Party. He is a member of the Texas House of Representatives. He has been set as a rising star, which is absolutely true. He has been serving since 2018, where I believe he did end up winning by quite a large margin, though. And what we end up with, he was the youngest member of the Texas legislature. And so that's really going to be a very interesting thing to watch here. He won his first race in a special election in 2018, originally by that's going to be 1.8%. And then he won the following election by 3.4 with the incumbency status. He won then by 3, and then by 50 points in the next election. Most likely he was redistricted into a bluer district at that point, though. So that isn't necessarily as strong. But then in 2024, yeah, there wasn't even any competition. So he probably got redrawn into a bluer district. But in the beginning, he was in a relatively competitive district, and then he managed to win. So what generally is the idea here is he's a somewhat appears to be a somewhat Christian Democrat who overperforms relatively strongly, and he's seen as a rising star. So there's a relative bit of hype around his candidacy from what I've seen there, and so that's going to be the main showdown for the Democrats. Colin Allred, who comes off of the national attention from the potential seen as the potential flip opportunity in 2024. It could honestly be seen in another reality where it wasn't as red of a year, where you end up with potential wins for Casey and Brown, narrow loss for Tester, but actually in Texas, you could potentially see in some other reality somewhere that Allred ended up winning. He was a very relatively strong candidate. And so this would mean that Democrats would essentially end up with the upper hand in the Senate, which would be very interesting. They would the Republicans would need J.D. Vance's tie-breaking vote to get anything through, and so this would definitely be a very different situation than we are in right now, and also because it's messed up a bit, that would actually end up being 48.25. So there we go. There's essentially what we'd look at, and Osborne potentially might have ended up winning there, actually, because I would have taken half from him and only half from Fisher, so that would have been a bit off. So actually, it'd be closer to like it's like 3 or 4 points off. So 49 and then 0.25, and then you end up with 50.25. You actually end up with Senator Osborne as well. And so then you'd actually end up with Democrats with the upper hand here, and the Republicans would have to work with Osborne to get anything passed. That would be very interesting in a different scenario that's not that far off. I mean, it's a bit of a change, but he still is coming off of that national attention. There was a lot of that on that race that was in Texas. I mean, 8.5 points is still not very bad. Again, 6.6 war rating. So that's what we're going to be really looking at in the Democratic side now, coming down to be competitive. If Beto O'Rourke jumps into the race, that actually would probably just end up stealing the fate for the Democrats at this point, because then you end up having a three-way race. But Colin Allred just has a few House representatives that have endorsed him. James Tellerico does not have anybody yet, but he did only announce not all that long ago. So then what we end up with is going on for the Republican primary. And so the interesting thing here is that we are looking at a two-way race here. This has been around for a while, though. John Cornyn, the incumbent U.S. senator, is being challenged by the current Attorney General, Ken Paxton. And so Paxton has run alongside Governor Greg Abbott for a while now. And so Greg Abbott won against Beto O'Rourke by 10.1 points in 2020. But all the way back since 2014, when Abbott first took the seat, that's going to be when there was the races in Texas. We have here is, I'm not really sure where I can find any specific results here, but he actually did win Bexar County, which is actually interesting, and Harris County. Okay, so, but anyway, that's when he was on the ticket. He had essentially been on for a long time. He's continued to win re-election. He's a relatively strong candidate, but he actually got impeached by the Republican-led Texas House of Representatives, so that is somewhat concerning. That's going to be the main way of attack there. But if we look at the current odds, Ken Paxton is narrowly ahead against John Cornyn, but he was quite a bit ahead not all that long ago. He was at 57%, and all the way is down to 49. And you do have Wesley Hunt on there as well, but that is just a U.S. representative. He has just expressed interest. It's not official that he is going to enter the race or not as of right now. But the interesting thing I did forget about the Democratic primary was the odds here. You had James Tallarico already, before he even announced, actually took the lead at one point in late August. Then Colin Allred took the lead again, and then right before he announced, he launched up into the lead. I believe he actually announced on the 8th that he was in, and he has actually been in the lead by quite a bit since then. Beto O'Rourke is only at 3%, though. He likely would not win again, as he did relatively okay he did pretty well in 2018, but then he did end up losing to Abbott by over 10 percentage points. So he's generally seen as a bit gone by this point for the Democrats. So what we're going to be looking at here again is going to be John Cornyn versus Ken Paxton. John Cornyn is generally seen as a bit too moderate by some more extreme right wing populist wings of the right wing populist wing of the party here, and that's going to be the main thing that we're going to be watching for. That is, how will that end up going for John Cornyn, as he is aiming to be able to hold on to that seat again, since he has been in the Senate for 4 terms now. He's running for a 5th term in office. And the main thing is, will he be able to hold on against that Senate challenge? Narrowly, right now, that's a no, but it's been tightening a bit. It was originally as bad as 3-1 in late May, but now things have started to come back together, and that was during a scandal with a divorce with Ken Paxton. It's been quite a bit closer since then, but still, John Cornyn has never taken back the lead since mid-April. So this is going to be a very interesting race to be watching, of course. The incumbent, more establishment wing of the party versus the more MAGA base wing in the state of Texas, and that could have some interesting ramifications for across the entire country. So thank you all so much for watching today's video. If you have any video ideas, do feel free to let me know. Make sure to follow on X, on Threads, on Substack especially. I'm making long form content, also released today in politics, we'll be getting back to in a bit. And so, again, thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day.